Notion Calendar has slowly but steadily become a really powerful productivity machine. It's been my daily driver since it initially released, but I keep seeing a lot of confusion around what it can actually do. Plus, Notion recently released a ton of really significant updates, so it's time for a thorough guide. In this video, I will walk you through everything you need to know to set up Notion Calendar the right way, stay on top of your to-do list, and a few of the hidden tricks that take Notion Calendar from quite nice to really powerful. Let's dive in. To kick things off, let's actually take a look at what role Notion Calendar will play in your overall tech setup, because it can be a little bit confusing. So that's why I created this flowchart, just to visualize what purpose this all has. Now, let's start from the top, right? Sort of the Notion ecosystem. The central part that you will use, right, to navigate Notion will be your Notion account. And under your Notion account, you can have a series of Notion workspaces, right? So you might have one Notion workspace for your, personal life. Then you might have another Notion workspace for your setup with, maybe your partner or with a group of friends to do some things together. And that all belongs under that area. You then might also have other Notion accounts, right? So this might be your personal Notion account tied to your personal email address. And then you might have a Notion account from your employer, right? If your company uses Notion. And here again, right, you might have maybe one or several workspaces, although for most people, right, this will look fairly simple and you probably just have one Notion workspace for the company that you work in, and then you have one Notion workspace for your private life. But for example, I have I think a dozen at least across the whole system. And then, of course, you have calendars, right? So you might be on Google Workspace, right? Or on a normal Gmail account. So there you have your, Google Calendar, or maybe you're in the Apple ecoverse and have an Apple Calendar. Or in my case, right, you might have both. Now, all these things flow together in Notion Calendar. And the way it works is that your Notion Calendar will be tied to one main Notion account. So we go through the sign-up process in a moment. But my recommendation is that you sign up for Notion Calendar with your personal email and your personal Notion account, because that will be the one that you will use always to access Calendar. So even if you switch later companies, right, and your company Notion account gets changed, you're sure to keep everything here. And no matter what Notion account you use to set up Calendar in the beginning, you are able to integrate with pretty much any workspace in which you are a member, right? Whether you are a member in there with your main Notion account or whether you are a member with another Notion account. Last but not least, Notion Calendar, right, pulls in then from your other calendar tools like Google or Apple. At the time of filming, it doesn't support Outlook Calendar yet, right? So that's one ecosystem that is not supported, but it's basically the central hub, right? Across all your workspaces and across all your calendars can show you everything that's on your plate in one place. In order to sign up for Notion Calendar, you have two options. Either you can go to the Notion Calendar download page, right, and download it as an app for your computer, which is in general what I recommend. Link for that in the description. Or you can go to calendar.notion.so to open Notion Calendar in the web, which is what I'll just do here for the walkthrough purpose. If you do so, right, and you're currently not logged in anywhere, it will ask you to log into your Notion account. Now, again, right, it's very important that when you do this, you use your personal email that is tied to your personal Notion account to make this a bit easier. If you don't have a Notion account at all yet, right, or if there's no Notion account tied to the email that you're using, Notion will create an account for you, right? So you will always have a Notion account tied to the login that you use for Calendar. Once you signed into your Notion account, this is the interface that you will see for Notion Calendar. You might also have already a prompt to authorize your first calendar during your setup. If so, go ahead and do that, right? So it can connect to either your Google Calendar or Apple Calendar, and then you will land in the general UI, and you will also get a little bit of an onboarding key on the side. We'll go through all of that in a moment, but first, let's have a look at the UI. On the left side, you have your month preview. You have a scheduling option that we'll take a closer look on later. You then see your connected calendar accounts, right? So far, I have the main calendar that is tied to the main email showing up here. And then you see I can add more calendar accounts and I can add Notion databases. In the middle of the screen, which takes up most of the space, is the actual calendar part, right? So currently this is set, as we can see here, the top to a week view, and we have my today starting here. And on the right, you have this side pane, which changes context based on what you're actually clicking on. In the beginning, right, when you use Notion Calendar for the first time, you will see this onboarding guide here. You have this option to invite more people and shows you a few useful shortcuts. But while we can click close this for now, we don't really need that and can instead jump into the settings ourselves. The very first thing that you want to do then is go into your settings and connect all your calendars. In order to do so, you can either go, if you're on the desktop, right up here, and you will have the option to jump into your settings through that. On the web, you can click on your profile icon and you see here the options for settings. Quick tip, throughout the interface, Notion always tells you in this light gray the shortcut that you can use instead, because that's the really cool thing about Notion Calendar. It's really built for power users, which makes it very easy to navigate. So instead of clicking here, I can also just, be anywhere else in the calendar, and then I press G and then S, right? And magically my settings appear. Now we want to ignore the general ones for now and jump right to integrations, the calendars section. And here's where you want to create all your accounts, right? No matter where you have a Google account or an iCloud account, make sure it all pulls into here so you see all your responsibilities, right? All your calendar events across the different areas of your life in this one tool. For this test purpose, right, I'm going to leave it at this one account, and then I'm going to click into conferencing. Now under conferencing, you can connect your preferred web meeting solution. If you use Google Meet, it's very easy, right? For that, you just click into the dropdown and you select Google Meet, and that will then pull the Google Meet from your main account anyway, right? That is linked. So in this case, it would just tie to my hello@matthiasfrank-consulting.com account. But if you use something like Zoom, right, you can click here to connect your Zoom account. If you have a separate meeting tool, right, that doesn't integrate directly with Notion, you can add it through a stationary custom link. And that will help us later when we set up any meeting, so that it automatically generates a Zoom meeting, right, or a Google Meet link, and we can jump into that without having to do any manual setup there. Let's continue to Notion. And this is where things get exciting. So far, right, it's been a pretty normal calendar tool with the usual functionality. But here's where the Notion part comes in. You can now connect any number of Notion workspaces, right? Remember the earlier flowchart? That should somehow sync into your system. And by default, it will show you all the workspaces that are tied to your account that you just signed in with, right? So for example, for me, it shows my MF Consulting default workspace. But if you have workspaces under a different Notion account, right, you can use the button here at the very top to sign into them as well. So in my case, I want to connect my main account. So I'm going to click on connect, and then we'll go through the onboarding. It already pops in, right? In this case, since we're logged in, all it took was one click, and now we have the workspace here. If we wanted to add any other workspaces, right, we could go through that and click on connect as well. For the last option under integrations, we have AI meeting notes. Now, this requires you to be on a Notion plan that has AI, right? So you will need either business or enterprise for this to work in at least one of the workspaces, right, that are a part of your Notion setup here. And if that's the case, then you can use Notion's AI meeting note taker, right, and connect it with your calendar as well. In order for that, the easiest way to get started, right, is to make sure that you have a meetings database in your Notion setup, right? I just created a simple demo meeting database for this purpose, but very important, right? Make sure you always do this in a database, not just as individual pages, and that this, of course, connects to the rest of your system. If you have questions about this, right, I have a very deep dive into how to build a perfect Notion setup for business, right, for your company, or a dedicated one for a VC setup. Link for that down below in the description. For now, right, let's just keep it to this very simple one. We can add some properties later. And in order to connect that, right, in order to make sure that this is the location where we store all our meeting notes, let's click in here and change this from the private section to my demo meeting base, right? So I'm going to click in here and I'm going to start typing demo Notion meeting notes, right? Here they are. And now this will be where they will be stored. We can choose to auto share with participants, right? So that means if our meeting notes are in a private area that not everyone might have access to, it will automatically add them for access. in general, right, with Notion Workspace, I recommend to have this publicly accessible. So in my case, I would probably turn this off because it's anyway shared. And then what we can decide, right, is if Notion will be our main meeting note taker, then we can say, okay, auto add them for every single event. Now, if Notion is your default meet taker, then I would highly recommend you do this, right? Because you want to take notes ideally on all the events, and toggling this on will mean that whenever you create a new meeting with someone, right, you will get an entry in your database to take notes for that. We're close to wrapping up the initial setup, but before we get that, we need to do a few things under general. First, decide whether you want to see weekends or not. In my case, definitely yes, because I work a lot on the weekends and I have a lot of events on them, so I need to see them in my calendar. But in case you want to have a cleaner focus on just your week, you can turn them off. I also want to see my declined events, and I definitely want to see week numbers, right? So I'm going to turn this on, and then I will get here next to the month also the information that it's currently week 35. After that, we can choose when to start our week, whether we want to start our week on Sunday or on any other day of the week. Now, I don't know why you would choose to start your week on any other day other than Monday, right? I'm from Europe. I don't think anything else makes sense, but the world is yours here. So whatever floats your boat, do that. Next, we can choose what T does. T will be a very important shortcut because it allows us to go always back to today. And here we can choose whether it always just shows me sort of the entry where I see today, or whether we want to align today. The difference is the following. If I click out of here, right, and I just go to any random week, let's say the first week of July, if I press T, I jump back and you see I'm in the last week of August, right, Sunday 31st when I'm recording this. If I go back to my settings and I choose to instead align today in view, and we go to anything else, right, we see that if I press now T, my today entry is on the left, right? So it's sort of like the difference is you see today onwards, or you see today relative to your setup, which in this case is a week. I prefer it to align, right? When I jump to today, I usually want to see things in the future and don't care so much about things in the past, but this depends, again, of course, on your preference. With events with participants, right, if you want to show the upcoming meeting in the context panel, right, here on the side, you can choose the time duration here, right? So if you want something to pop up there soon enough, right, you can say, okay, maybe even 12 hours. If you think in rather short instances, 1 or 30 minutes. But in general, right, this won't be too much of a difference. It just depends on, the simple entry that pops up here, and you'll probably see it anywhere there, but feel free to play around with that. After that, we're pretty much done, right? We can choose our language. We can choose our hour format, right? So if we want to do a 12-hour format or a 24-hour, in my case, I want 24 hours. And then in terms of time zone, right, we can configure those in a second. Google Maps is my preferred location link. And then, of course, very important, do you want to do light mode, right, or dark mode? Now, personally, even though I generally like the feeling of dark mode as an abstract concept, I have a hard time reading the interface in dark mode. So I always use Notion Calendar in light mode, but of course, feel free to change this to your preference. In the browser, the only thing that's left in the settings are notifications, where we can set up browser notifications. But if you follow my recommendation and use the desktop app, right, where I'm going to switch right now, you will also find additional options. First, you can set up your system preferences for these meeting notifications. So in my case, what I like is I like to get this, join the meeting conferencing 1 minute before the meeting, right? That means up in the top right corner, right, I get this little alert that a new meeting is there and I can join it with one click. I also want the sound, right, because that just reminds me that something is going on. You can, of course, change this to a different time, but I find 1 minute is perfect. And then you can set up the menu bar. The menu bar is a little widget that lives, well, in your menu bar, right? So up here, right, I see my next upcoming event, right, is that a friend of mine will arrive in 7 hours. And that's just very neat, right, to always get this preview there, even if I don't look at my calendar. So I would recommend to turn this on. I would recommend, right, that you set include events, probably just to today and tomorrow, because realistically, that's what you care about, not things too far in the future. And you can decide, right, do you want to see events without participants, so your own time blocks? I actually typically turn this off because I really only care, to be notified about my next meeting with someone, whether that's in person or online. And yeah, other than that, right, you have a few more shortcuts, but that's pretty much it for the settings. Now we're ready, locked and loaded to make actually use of Notion Calendar. Oh, I forgot one last thing. If you're in the desktop app, you have also under general the option to start it on system startup, which I recommend you turn on because usually, right, you want to have your calendar with you all the time. So that way, whenever your Mac starts, your calendar opens as well. Back in our main interface, there's one last setting that we can do here, and that are time zones. By default, it will pick the time zone that is tied to your default calendar here. So in my case, that's currently European summertime. You could click into that if you wanted to change the label, right? So I could just change this to 1 if I wanted to, although, you know, CST makes the most sense for me. And then if you wanted to, you could add additional ones. And so I can click on plus. And if you always work with people, for example, in New York, right, you can simply type New York, and now you can add it in here as my label, right? I might want to add New York because that's a bit clearer than GMT -4 for me. And now we see here in our sidebar, right, always our main time zone plus the other one, which makes it just a bit easier to schedule international things. Time for our first event. Now, if you're syncing your existing calendar accounts, you probably have a bunch of them already in here. But in order to set up your first one through Notion Calendar, just highlight any time slot here, and you see my side pane now switches to the setup mode. From my normal side pane, right, to the setup, the second I highlight any block. I can give this a name, right, my first meeting. We have a time for it. We have our date. We can set up the usual calendar stuff, right, like a repeat on all the event. And then we can start adding participants. In order to add a participant, I'm going to click here and I'm going to add their email address. Now, when I click then on here to confirm this, what happens next will depend on whether the other person is a part of my organization or not. If they are a part of my organization, which means, right, they are in the same Google Workspace, so part of your team, you will immediately get a calendar overlay for them. So you can choose, okay, where does this meeting make sense? If the person is not in your organization, right, of course, you don't see their calendar, but it's really helpful for internal scheduling. Let me show you what I mean, right? This email is part of my organization. So if I click on here, I see in a moment this big red overlay, right, which shows me all the other blocks when the person is already booked. And I can easily hide it, right, if that is too much or too distracting by clicking on the overlay. But particularly, right, if you have now 3-4 people and need to find a meeting time, that can be quite useful. Next, we see that Notion has already set up a Google Meet link for this. But if I don't want that, right, if I want this to be an in-person meeting or I want a different provider, I can click on Google Meet, right, and change that here. We also see that it suggests my meeting notes, right? So this will be then creating an entry in my meeting note database later when I launch this so that we can record everything. And I can add additional docs or links. Now, this is really cool if you have specific docs in your Notion setup, right, of things that you want to discuss. Maybe there's a brainstorm, right, or a specific passage in a handbook or so, right? Then you could click in there and you can start searching. And all the documents that you have access to in your different Notion workspaces will pop up here as an option. Last but not least, you have, of course, location, right? If it is an in-person meeting, description, setting, and then the general calendar stuff, right? You could swap the calendar, you can change the event color, and you can set the reminder for this meeting. But for now, this all looks good, so let's send this invite. So I also added a second page here, right, as the briefing instructions, in this case, you know, the finalized OKR setup. That's the one we want to discuss here. And now let's assume it's time for my meeting. So what happens now is I can click on, you know, on the page to start the AI meeting notes. That will open up Notion, right? It will create a page in this demo meeting database here. And now we can start and turn it on. Now, since I'm in the browser, right, it will tell me that it's not ideal for the setup. So we can either start with my limited audio here or open it in the Notion app. Usually, right, you will have it open in the app, which makes everything a bit easier. But yeah, that's how easy it is, right, to then jump from your calendar event right into the meeting notes to set us up. You will also get actually a reminder in the browser at the time of the event, but since it's still a bit in the future, we don't get that right now. With our first event out of the way, let's look at a few more options, right? If I add another block here, one thing that you'll notice is that we also have this toggle here at the top. So rather than setting up a regular event, we can also switch to one of Google's specific parts, right? This is integrated with the way that Google displays certain things. So we could have focus time, right? We could have out of office. Both of these mean that if there's any meeting coming in during that time, we'll automatically decline any meeting requests. And then you could set up a birthday, which would sync to your Google Contact. Again, right, depends sort of on what calendars you sync in there anyway. If you have it set up in your Apple calendar, right, then birthdays will show up anyway already, but those are just a few additional options here. For a more granular or more big picture view, you can then go up here, right, to your week and say, actually, I just want to see the specific day, the specific month, right, or any number of days. And you see again, we have some shortcuts. So I can simply press D to focus on my day view. I can press M, right, to focus on seeing the whole month. And then I could set any number of days, right? So if I just type 4, I switch to a 4-day view. If I type 2, 2-day view, right? And then again, back to W for the week. Really useful if you quickly need to get a big picture overview. At this point in time, we want to get Notion really into the mix. Because so far, right, we're just managing our calendars from Google and Apple in this Notion-like interface. And the only real Notion integration is that we can get our Notion meeting notes, right, and add sort of docs and links. But to take this one step further, let's quickly head to Notion. Because one of the superpowers of Notion Calendar is that it can show me all my database entries on there. So let's say we have this database, right, which has a bunch of tasks. This is actually a global task database, right? So it doesn't just have my tasks, it has tasks for the whole team, of course, in this demo setup. And in here, what I want now is I want to show my tasks in Notion Calendar. The requirement for this is that we have at least one date property on it, right? In this case, my deadline property. And then what I can do is I can just right click the view and then here say manage in calendar. Once I do this, I will get switched back, right, to calendar. It will load for a moment. And then we should see in a moment that here where it says add Notion database, right, it will add that view. Currently gives me the pop-up, right, it's working on this. And here we have it, right? We see now from my workspace MF Consulting, we have demo tasks connected. And that means that our entries from Notion will now show up there. Let's actually go back, right, and make sure that our deadlines are somewhere where we can see them, right? So let's just put this to the 31st. Let's put this to tomorrow, the day after. Oh, oops, that was too far, right? To the here to somewhere in September. Let's also put this on August 31st. And that's pretty good. Let's switch back. And in a moment, we will see them pop up here at the top. And here we are, right? My tasks, they now show by default as these full day events at the top of my calendar. I can then take any of these tasks and now manage them through here, right? So if I see my complete JavaScript course module 5, if I want to change this, well, I can simply drag this around, right? I could drag this to Wednesday, for example. I could also leave it here, right? I could give this a certain time block, a longer one. And you see it updates it here. And if I switch back to Notion, we also see that this event right now has a deadline of 8:45 to 12:30 p.m. Now, of course, we can talk about this in a second, right? Having the deadline with a specific time doesn't make so much sense. That's more for time blocking. But the general thing is clear, right? You can move these tasks around in here and that will sync back to Notion. You also now have the option to update the properties directly from here. So you can see we get this little indication here actually next to our event that tells me what status does something have in Notion, right? We have this open one for research, this one here where our current status is not started. And then for the ones that are in progress, right, or waiting, we have the other elements. And when we click into them and see the options, right, we can see here is my status. I can change it right here from this, for example, to completed to indicate that this is now done. We also see our select properties, right? So my priority and my area, I can change that from here as well. We see our other date properties on this database. And if I had any checkboxes, we would see that too. All properties are not yet supported, although by the time that you watch this video, maybe we get more. But for example, right, my notes don't show up there yet. My formula doesn't show up there yet, and my assigned property doesn't show up there yet either. But Notion keeps adding more and more of these databases, so hopefully soon we'll be able to update everything from here. And if there's a property that you can't update, right, you can always click on Manage in Notion, and you will jump right to that entry in your Notion database. Let's take this one step further. Currently, we only see 4 entries here, right? Because only 4 of my entries have a deadline, but we have 2 other elements. Well, we can still manage them through here by just clicking on my database here on the side. That pops up this new sidebar in Notion, which shows me all my tasks. So you see, right, first at the top, you have this, tells me this is from demo tasks. It's from the My Task view. That's the only view that's currently synced. We will sync another one in a second. And here we can now decide, right, which elements we want, and we can simply drag and drop them from here onto the page. Now, if I take a page that's already on there, right, complete JavaScript, I will simply move that one around. But if I take one that doesn't have an entry yet, right, like scheduled dentist appointment, we will place it for the very first time and give it a date. You can also see that we could alternatively, right, click into the edit option, right, and then we see this add deadline. I just got a notification that updating this property failed, right, so it doesn't fill it out in the moment, but now it worked, right. Here it pulls it in now. But just like with the Notion card, I could also click on, edit here and say, actually, okay, from August 1st, actually this should be, on the 5th, right? And we see it pops up there as well. And of course, all the other properties are an option to change as well through here, at least the ones that pull into Notion calendar. How about creating new entries? Well, that's also possible. We can either take an existing entry and duplicate it by clicking on the 3 dots, right, and say duplicate. And now I have 2 of these complete JavaScript courses in a moment, and I can schedule both of them individually. Or we can click on plus to create a new entry, right? So this one creates a new empty one. We have also the shortcut Command N for it. And we see we get now this new empty card, right? Test entry through Notion calendar. Let's call it that. If I confirm in my Notion database, right, we see the test entry popping up in a second, sometimes small delay. And if I go ahead now, right, and were to say, okay, let's actually edit this. Oops, where did it go? Sometimes it pops around here a little bit. Let's move this here, right? And let's give this then some, like a specific priority. Medium in the area will be work, right? If I switch back to Notion, we see medium, and in a moment, the area for work will pop up there as well. For more options, we can click on the settings here. And the first thing we can change is the color. So we can say, actually, show all the Notion entries in blue. Then we see what are the visible properties and how do we sort it? And for both these settings, even though they show up here in calendar, we actually need to manage them through Notion. So let's go back to the Notion database. And for example, let's hide the area property, right? Let's make this disappear. And then if I go back to Notion in a moment, we'll see that that disappeared here, right? With property visibility, it also shows me area is now hidden. Very important. These settings need to be managed through the specific view that you're syncing to Notion calendar. Remember earlier, this was the one that I right-clicked on and said, please manage this in calendar. And that means that these settings apply. So whether I show the area property on the all tasks view doesn't matter, right? Everything in here is being pulled over. And that's very important to keep in mind, because that means you can tailor your specific views exactly to the way that they need to show up in Notion calendar. Because, as you also notice, it's not like all tasks in this database show up here, right? It's only the ones that are assigned to me. And that's because I've set up this rule here, right? Assigned contains me. And I can further narrow this down. Maybe you only want to see elements in Notion calendar that are not completed yet. And the easiest way to do this, right, is to go in here and say rule, okay, and where status is not completed. Now, very importantly, you need to save this, otherwise it won't carry over. And now if I go back to Notion calendar, right, it reloads and my one task that was in progress, completed, disappears. Again, right, you could stack any kind of filters on top. You could also say maybe only show high priority items there, right? So let's actually remove this filter and say instead, and where priority is high, right? Now we have only 3 elements. If I save this, head back over to Notion calendar, now we see only the elements that have actually a high priority in a moment. And there we go, left with only 3 tasks. That also has a few more consequences for your workflows, but I want to touch on those in a second. First, let's look at the remaining settings. We see that we can group things. So if we wanted to, we could say, okay, let's group this by status. So we see our different toggles for not started, in progress, and completed. Currently, again, we have only very few properties supported here, but as we, as Notion keeps building this out, we assume that we will have more, variety when it comes to grouping. We can actually through here also filter out completed, right? Completed appeared again because I took that filter out in Notion in the database, but it's one of the few things that we can say in calendar actually show me only my incomplete entries, so I don't need to set a filter in Notion. And then in terms of date, right, I can choose, do I want to show all entries in here, or do I only want to see unscheduled entries or scheduled entries, which basically translate, do I want to see entries that have a date in the date property or not? In my case, I want to see everything here. Last but not least, you have the primary properties. Now, if you click on here right now, that's two properties. It's the deadline and the status. And that means, right, everything that gets pulled over to Notion Calendar needs to have a date property. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And the status property is also very deeply integrated, right, with the option to group and the option to filter that out automatically. So if you have several different date properties or several different status properties in your database, you can tell Notion Calendar in this case, right, which is the one it should use. So for example, in our Notion database, I actually have a deadline, and in terms of properties, I also have a DO date, right, to schedule it. So I could swap between those, right, and say, actually, I want the DO date to display here, right, rather than the deadline, and then all these would change to the other one. So those are pretty much all the settings, right? Let's click on confirm, and now let's have a look at how we can put all these building blocks together to build our custom work pipelines for Notion Calendar. For this example, what I want to set up is basically two different ways of seeing my elements. I want on the one hand to see the deadlines for my tasks, but I want to also be able then to schedule my tasks using DO dates. In order to do so, let's first go back to Notion and change our view. Let's rename this, right? And let's call this instead of my tasks, deadlines. Let's make sure we have a new rule here, right? And we say, okay, here, show me everything where deadline is not empty, right? And then we take out the priority filter and instead just say like assigned to contains me, because I want to keep it to the ones that I am responsible for. So that's my first change. And now with that change, right, in my Notion calendar, in a moment, we'll see all the tasks that I am responsible for that have a deadline. Now, right now, right, we have this weird situation where we have a bunch of them like still as like these entries within. And for a deadline, right, usually, of course, we don't have a duration. So I'm just going to quickly go in, right, and for the ones that we have there, right, I'm just going to take out actually the time, right. Let's remove that. So we just have any kind of duration. And that means, right, they will pop up to the top here in a moment. Then, since it's deadlines, I want to change the color. So I'm going to click into demo tasks, right? And I'm going to say, okay, for demo tasks, let's make this here, those entries red. Next, let's make sure we can plan our work. So I'm going to duplicate deadlines, and I'm going to call this work plan. And here I'm going to change my filter. In this case, my filter will actually be just that it is assigned to me. Perfect. And now I can click on save this for everyone. I want to now pull in the work plan also into Notion. And then I have two options for this. I can either right click it here, and say manage in calendar, or I can go to Notion calendar and under certain conditions, I can click on this drop down and click on add view. Now currently, as you can see, this only shows 4 views, all tasks today, calendar and planned, and that doesn't really match what we have here. The reason for that is that this is a linked database view, not the original database. And at this point, I need to do a quick excursion to Notion 101, right? Very, very important. In Notion, you have your original database, and ideally that original database lives somewhere in your backend. Then you create linked views to build dashboards to actually interact with it, right? If this is something that you're not familiar with, make sure to check out one of my beginner tutorials around this, because it's one of the most important aspects when building scalable Notion workspaces. Now, Notion Calendar only will show you options here for the views on the actual original instance, because you could have dozens of linked views, right? And that would otherwise clutter things up. Just to show you how this looks, right? Here I'm now on the original version of the database called demo tasks. And you see here are my 4 views, and these are exactly the ones, right, that I have available in here. But again, right, you don't have to set up your database, your views for Notion Calendar here. You can set them up anywhere on a linked view, and then just click on them, right, and say, okay, I would like to manage this in the calendar. That's exactly what we're going to do now, right? We're going to right-click Work Plan and then say Manage this in Calendar. In a moment, right, Notion Calendar will pull everything in and we can start having both these two different views of my same database here. So you see, demo tasks now shows this little new toggle, and I have my deadlines and I have my work plan. And you already see right now I have my red deadlines at the top, but then I have my green little work plan entry here. And at the top, right, I see complete JavaScript module, right? That's my deadline entry. And then I see here my complete JavaScript module, that's my DO date. So, right, I can manage different date properties of the same database in Notion Calendar. And this allows me now to do something like, for example, right, I know, okay, my deadline is tomorrow. So I add now a work block here to work on my complete JavaScript module. And again, right, all these things sync back into Notion. So I know now, right, my deadline for my complete JavaScript is September 3rd. And my DO date, the time when I plan on working this, right, for my time block is September 2nd, 2025. Now, if this doesn't show up like this immediately for you, remember, go to the settings. So click on demo tasks and then switch to the new view that you just added, right, the work plan. And on here, you can click on the settings and you can say, okay, please make sure that my primary property here is the DO date. By default, Notion often pulls in the same date again, right? So you will have to go quickly through that setup. But once you change this, you have then your two different entries parallel next to each other. Right? If I click on deadlines, I only see things with a deadline. And if I click on work plan, I see everything, regardless of whether it has a deadline or not, because that is the way, right, we have to set up those views in Notion. And that means now, right, I can take whatever I want from my work plan, right, and see when I plan this. So I can start dragging them in my calendar, right, and through this time block my week to indicate, okay, when do things actually happen, right? When are my test entries? When do I plan on working on them? And then at the same time, right, see the deadlines popping up here. The same, of course, is true for other databases, right? You cannot just pull in several views for one database, but you could also have next to your tasks, right, your projects, events, like a big, content calendar, whatever it is. Everything that has a date property in Notion, you can pull it in here, and then you want to always think through this specific setup. It will always be this 3 steps, right? What database do I want to see in Notion? Which specific view of this database do I want to see? And then if I have several date properties on my database, which one should be used for the Notion calendar display? Now, when working with this, you need to keep one thing in mind, and that is that your entries that you're adding here from Notion are only shown like this in Notion Calendar. They are not actually synced back to, for example, the Google Calendar, right, or the Apple Calendar that you have integrated. So if I would open now Google Calendar on the side, right, I would still only see my first meeting. In order to get this overlay, right, of calendar events on the one hand and Notion database entries on the other hand, you need to use Notion Calendar. In case you want to move something over, you actually need to move it out of the Notion database, right? So it's usually nothing that I would recommend, but just as an FYI, if you say, okay, I have this test entry, right? And this should actually not be in here, but it should be in my calendar. You can swap that here, right? Just like for a normal calendar event, where you can say, okay, what calendar should this be into, right? Let's move myself out of the way. Oops. You could say, actually, instead of having this meeting live in the calendar, let's push this to the Notion database, right? It works that way. If I do that, we will move this and it will give me an error message because the meeting can't be handled then, right? This is no longer now a meeting. Right now it's a database entry in my Notion. Or the other way around, I can take this database entry, right, and I can swap it to my calendar. And now, once that's the case, it will show up in Google Calendar, but it will disappear from my Notion database. And that means, right, we have sort of pros and cons for both approaches. Of course, on a Notion database, right, item, we won't have the ability to invite people, right? So on my task, I can't invite people. I can't, add my scheduling, my conferencing, all these things to it. So it's best, right, to keep these two things separate. Entries on your actual calendar, which are meetings for the most part with people, and then items in your databases, which will be your tasks, to-do items, and so on. Moving on, let's look at one of my favorite features of Notion Calendar, and that is scheduling. As you might know, right, you have these tools like Calendly or cal.com where you can create booking links and someone can use that link to pick a slot in your calendar. Or Notion Calendar can do a lightweight version of this as well. And I personally use it very heavily. I use it in combination with cal.com. Cal.com is sort of my standing booking link, right? I have my general availability in my normal call hours on every given day. And then I know if I just want to set up a regular meeting with someone, I can send them this link and they can book themselves in some time, right? Goes up to 3 months in the future. Notion Calendar, on the other hand, I usually use for specific situations when I want to have a bit more control over when someone can schedule. So in order to do this, you can simply press S on your keyboard. And now we're swapping to this, different overlay. And I can select availability. For example, I can say, okay, today I have some time, and I have some time here, and I have some time here, and I have some time here. And you see my side pane on the side starts filling out what it calls a one-off link. Meeting with MF Consulting, where I could change the title for this. And then it gives me a link that I can share. And it has some other options, right? I can, for example, set an expiration date, right? That's how long is this scheduling valid. Is this a single-use link, right? Can a person only pick one slot, or can several people pick a slot? We have a snippet if you want to use this, right, to share with someone in the email, and it automatically fills out, right, the times that we have here. And then I also have the times down here below with the option to determine where should this meeting happen, right? Do we have a notice window, right? Can people only book with up to 30 minutes in advance, or can they basically book for in the next 50 minutes? And what is sort of the maximum time in advance? And then what I can do is I can create this link, right, and I can just copy this, and then I can navigate to this, and we can see how the scheduling experience looks from the other side. So here I am in a different browser window, and I just inputted the link. Now I can see, right, I can pick now some slots here, Sunday, 3:30, for example, or next week on the 2nd, 3 p.m. Right, that looks good. I can input my name and email, and once I do this, right, I will get both people will get an invite, and it will automatically add this meeting to this part of my calendar. The cool thing is that by default, Notion will respect conflicts. So if there is already a different thing going on here, right, you see that at the bottom, it will not offer that slot anymore. Very important though, this conflict scheduling only works with one calendar at a time, right? So it doesn't check all your calendars that you have connected. You need to sort of say, okay, what do you want it to check against? And it can't check against Notion databases. So it is a little bit limited in that sense, but still super useful, right? And through that, right, for example, if we have a different meeting coming up around that time, right, there was the Tuesday time, we just, add a big blocker and go back to here, right, we will see in a moment that the Tuesday slots after we refresh this will no longer be there, right, because now we have, this big blocker in our calendar. If you have a lot of these scheduling links, you can also start managing them through this section, right? You can always just click on your availability again, right? And we'll jump here and you can just click on edit and change it. For example, you can make something longer, right? Or you can, oops, not like this, that doesn't work, but you can remove something by clicking on done, right? And then just selecting that part and then removing that from the availability or here, and it will update the link. Or you can click on here, right? And it pops it out. And now you see, okay, here are my current links. And from there, it also gives you the option, right, to create a recurring link or one-off link. Recurring link is then very similar to cal.com, right? If I click on here, it then tells me, okay, what are my general availability slots? So you could say, okay, Monday, I always have time between 9 and 5, right? Tuesdays, actually, I want to only be available between 4 and 6, right? Or like 1800, that's my only availability, and so on, right? Can then, of course, set the other things as well. And then this is more like this recurring option, right? Similar to what I mentioned in cal.com, where at all times they can book you in. I'm not the biggest fan currently of this in Notion Calendar, just because it means it like creates these permanent highlights in it, and I don't want to really see them. So that's why, right, I keep things separate. cal.com for permanent scheduling and Notion Calendar for one-off scheduling, but still quite helpful to have it set up all in this tool and not needing a third-party application. Now, with these basics in place, right, you can take the usual Notion approach and really make these workflows your own. You know now, right, how to integrate your calendars and how to pull certain Notion databases into Calendar and modify them. So from here, the world is your oyster, right? You could go, for example, very deep into the time tracking system, right? I have a dedicated video for you on how to set this up in Notion. And then if you do your time tracking, you could show the results of your time tracking database, right? Again, in Notion Calendar, so that you have maybe a third view, right? Behind, besides deadlines and work plans, which is like, your actual work. And then you could, at the end of the week, in your weekly review, check your plan versus, how did you actually do things to see, okay, how good am I at figuring these things out? Or, right, you can start collaborating with your team and pull in sort of the vacation times in here. So you see always that you can assign tasks in there, right? If you don't have on deadlines the things set up that it filters for only your tasks, right? You could see the ones from your team and you can manage them through here for them, right? And if you're a manager and need to distribute workload, really so many cool opportunities. Now you know how to make the most of Notion Calendar. Notion really is a little bit like Apple here. The deeper you get into the ecosystem, the more useful every single part becomes. And there are so many little tips and tricks to discover. In fact, earlier this year, I sat down to share my favorite 117 Notion tips. It's the best resource, right, to quickly upskill your Notion skills and go from, okay, this is a nice tool to, wow, now I really understand it. Just click over here and I will see you in a second.